Hello and welcome to the Virtual Marketing Society Scotland Inspiring Minds session, sponsored by Edrington. I'm Ian Greenhill. I'm founder and MD of creative agency called Studio Something. So we make ideas that people genuinely like, that includes advertising ventures. We even make our own TV show, and I'll be chairing this session today. So the concept of the Inspiring Minds series, of which this webinar is actually part of, is to bring speakers and brands to Scotland that our members perhaps might have heard speak before. They'll speak about specific topics in areas that are of particular interest to our members, and where possible, they'll share tools and tips and practical ideas that could then potentially be used within their own businesses. So kind of supports the session today. On Twitter, use the hashtag Inspiring Minds and tag Marketing Society Scotland on Twitter as well. So Richard's session today will give a bit of an introduction to the field of behavioural science as it applies to marketing, using a simple framework to make sense of academic findings. Richard will cover some of the classic experiments that reveal the fascinating ways in which the human mind makes decisions and behaviour, as well as new and lesser known research that will give you the edge. Hopefully today you'll leave the session with new ideas for creative, an effective approach to your brief, and understanding of why ideas will work. So the way that we're going to run the session today is Richard will speak for about 45 minutes, and at the bottom you can use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the talk. I'll pick my favourites and then we'll ask them to Richard at the end. So for those of you that don't know, Richard Shotton is an author and founder of Astroten. So Richard authored the book The Choice Factory, which is a best-selling book on how to apply findings from behavioural science to advertising. The Choice Factory topped a global poll organised by BBH to find and it was named the best ever book on advertising. He started his career 19 years ago, working on accounts such as Coke, Lexus and CompareTheMarket.com before founding Astroten, which is a consultancy specialising in applying behavioural science to business problems. So I'm just going to hand you over to Richard now.
Thank you very much. As mentioned, today's session is going to be all about applying behavioural science to marketing. And all I mean by behavioural science is what people used to call social psychology. It's the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. And I would argue to you that there are three big reasons, the 3 R's, about why you should be interested in behavioural science. Now, the first is this is a very relevant topic to what we're all trying to do. If you pare back what our core role as marketers is, if you pare it back to the essentials, things like getting consumers to pay a premium for our brand, to pick our brand rather than another one, to buy our brand more regularly. All of these core tasks are trying to change the behaviour of the consumer. We are in the business of behaviour change. So why wouldn't you draw on 130 years of experimentation and research into what makes the most effective behaviour change? Because that's all that behavioural science is. So it's very, very relevant to our jobs. The second thing is it is robust. That's quite different from a lot of marketing theory. An awful lot of marketing theory is based on someone's opinion or their gut feeling. And that's not a good place to base multi-million pound decisions on. But behavioural science is very different. It's not based on anyone's opinion. It's based on the peer-reviewed academic experiments of some of the leading psychologists from around the world. Sometimes that's current figures like Kahneman or Richard Thaler. Sometimes that's historic figures like Elliot Aronson and B.F. Skinner. But because of this basis, because of this robust basis, we can have genuine faith in the findings. So it's relevant, it's robust. And then finally, the final R is its range. And this is a strength that I don't think gets discussed quite enough. And one of the facts of behavioural science is that it's been around for 130 years. The first psychology experiments were done in the 1890s by people like Hermann von Ebbinghaus. And since then, there have been literally tens of thousands of experiments. That means that whatever category you work in, whatever discipline of market you work in, whatever challenge you have, there will be an experiment out there that can help you solve that problem. It might not solve it completely, but it will certainly give you a good steer. So this range is a really big strength. But there is a downside to the range as well. And I think it might explain why behavioural science isn't used as much as it should be. That there are so many experiments that sometimes the topic can feel a bit bewildering. That people don't know quite where to start. So if we're going to turn behavioural science from something that is discussed at conferences, that we have interesting training sessions about, to something that is used day in, day out to help solve practical problems, I think we need to use a framework. A framework, just a simple set of rules and processes for turning what can be a nebulous, abstract set of ideas into something that is far more practical. There are many frameworks out there. I don't think it matters hugely which one you use. I mean, there are frameworks like COMBI by Susan Mickey, Cialdini's framework, BJ Fogg's framework, Mindspace. There are lots of different frameworks out there, but they all draw on the same information. So which one you pick is often a matter of taste. But the one that I would recommend, and the one that I wanted to take you through today, has two big benefits. It's very simple and it's very flexible. And that framework is the EAST framework. This was created by the Behavioural Insights team. This is the UK government team, which was set up in 2010 by the Cameron-Clegg Coalition, with the aim of making sure that all government communications and government policy is informed by behavioural science. And they distilled these tens of thousands of biases, or sorry, 10,000 experiments, thousands of biases, into 4 key principles. So EAST is an acronym. It stands for make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, and make it timely. And if when you get a brief, or if when you have a challenge, you apply these 4 principles to the problem at hand, it's a really good way of drawing on this great body of work from behavioural science. So what I thought we could do is quickly go through each of these principles, and I'll state kind of what the main idea is, an experiment or maybe 2 proving that idea and bring out some of the nuances, and then most crucially discussing some of the practical marketing applications. Now, rather than go through in the order that the Behavioural Insights team suggest, rather than having it as the EAST framework, we're going to do the SEAT framework. So we are going to start with make it social. And I wanted to start there because this is probably the most straightforward of the ideas and one of the most broadly applicable. And when people talk about make it social, what they are not referring to, this has nothing to do with social media, this has nothing to do with Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Rather, it's an idea around something called social proof. This is the idea that when we make decisions, we don't make those decisions as discrete, atomized individuals, but rather we look around to what others are doing. And if a course of behavior is seen to be popular, it will become more popular still. Now, this idea has been shown in tax repayment rates, music downloads, smoking rates, restaurant menus, again and again in a variety of situations. It's been shown in controlled experiments that if you can make the desired behavior appear popular, it will become more popular still. And I just want to take you through one of these experiments, and it's probably the most famous social experiment out there. It's a study done by Robert Cialdini, who was professor of psychology and marketing at Arizona State University. And he worked with a hotel chain in Southwest USA. and he wanted to test what message would best encourage guests to reuse their towels. So he started by splitting the rooms randomly into one of three groups, and in each different group, each different scenario, he altered the message that encouraged people to reuse their towels. So first group of rooms, he ran the control message, and this was very much like the messages you might see if you go to a hotel. It said, please reuse your towels because it's good for the environment. And in that scenario, 35% of guests, just over a third, reuse their towels. So that's his benchmark. His second group of rooms, he strips away any logical, rational, considered reason for getting the guests to reuse their towels. And instead he uses a social proof message. He makes it clear what the norm of behavior is. So he says, please reuse the towels because most guests do so. Now remember, in the control, 35% of people were reusing their towels. When he changed the message to social proof, now 44% of people reuse their towels. So a 9 percentage point swing, about a 25, 26% swing. So a significant improvement. But then he began to think, well, are other people equally influential? Are some people more influential than others on shaping our behavior? And he began to wonder whether it was people who were like us, people that we could see a relevant link with, who were most influential on our behavior. To test that hypothesis, his final group of rooms ran the message, please reuse your towels because most guests who've stayed in this particular room have done so. Now in that scenario, 49% of people reuse their towel. So a full 40% swing from the control. That was the most successful of messages. So what Cialdini had shown in these tests, and other people in other areas have since replicated, is that again and again, if you can make your product or the desired behavior that you want to happen appear popular, it will become more popular still. Now you could argue, of course, well, don't a lot of marketers know this already? A lot of brands out there state their popularity. Tunnock's chocolate bars, the last 50 years have been talking about the millions of units they shift each week. Carling or Tennent's often will say that they are Britain or Scotland's most popular lager. So what's behavioural science bringing to this tactic that some marketers know about already? Well, firstly, remember the nuance of Cialdini's experiment. You don't want to talk about what everyone's doing. You want to refer to your popularity amongst a relevant group. Now, Cialdini got it working with that very tenuous link with guests who stayed in this particular room. But other ways of using it might be, it's better to say, this is the most popular thing in Glasgow rather than Scotland, or this is the most popular hotel for families rather than amongst everyone. That element of specificity will make social proof more powerful. But beyond that, I think there's a bigger leap that brands can make. Most brands, when they use behavioural science, or certainly social proof, they do it in a very literal way. They go out and state directly and simply the volume of people who use their brand. They use behavioural science very literally. Sometimes they take an academic experiment and almost plonk it down on their communications. Now that will have a positive effect, but it's hardly using behavioural science in its most powerful way. If you want to get the full power of behavioural science, better to use it laterally. So rather than directly state your popularity, imply it through your design or other means. If that sounds a little bit abstract, let's have a more concrete example. So I want you to think about Apple back when they launched in the early 2000s. Now, When they launched their iPod, they were not the first to market. There were a number of other brands, people like Sony and Motorola had launched MP3 players before them. So Apple can honestly go out and say they were the most popular MP3 player. But luckily for Apple, their competitors allowed their success to be invisible. If you were on the train, for example, and someone was listening to a Sony MP3 player, you had no idea because the hardware was in their pocket and the only thing that was visible were the bland black earphones. So if someone were listening, if lots of people on the carriage were listening to Sony, you had no idea. Apple then used that to their advantage. In all their advertising, they made a big play of their distinctive white earbuds. Now, all their charter advertising includes those white earbuds. So as soon as you saw someone on the train or in a pub listening through white earphones, you knew they were listening to Apple. They looked like the market leader long before they actually were. Because by having this distinctive piece of design, they made their success visible or their usership visible, while their competitors allowed their success to be invisible. Apple started to harness social proof, create this virtuous circle long before they were actually the market leader. Now, Apple certainly aren't the only brand to do this. You can look around all sorts of different categories. Look at finance. Someone like Monzo, I think, is doing exactly the same trick at the moment. Every other mainstream bank allowed their success to be invisible to a degree. Now, you never noticed if someone pulled out a Bank of Scotland or a Halifax debit card because they were all the same bland colours. But Monzo, by using that hot pink, that coral card, they became very distinctive and much more notable. So they looked like they were a success long before they actually were. So when we're going through all these experiments, all these biases, what's important is not just to fixate on the specifics of the experiment, it's to look to the underlying core of the finding. And then you can interpret that literally, or like Apple and Monzo do, a bit more laterally. And I think that's where the real strength of behavioural science lies. If we take the robust academic nature of these experiments and ideas, but then we fuse onto them our creative thinking as marketers, that's when you get the biggest and the best results. But before we move away from social proof, I just want to go back to that towel experiment, because the first stage of the experiment, which I've discussed, is reasonably well known. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. But what's not so well known is Cialdini then did a follow-up. And in his follow-up, he didn't observe how people behaved, which is the classic standard approach of a psychology experiment. He asked people, which is how often marketers come to insights. So what Cialdini did was he recruited a panel of participants, just like many brands do. He sent them a survey, just like many brands do. And he said to the people, look, I want you to imagine you're going to a hotel. And I want you to imagine that you saw one of these three signs: the environmental message, the social proof message, the tailored social proof message. And Cialdini says, which would have influenced you to reuse your towels? Now think for a second, what do you think most people answered? Well, the results were very different to the observation. Most people, when they're asked directly, claimed they would be influenced by the environmental message, the opposite of what we saw when Cialdini ran his experiment. This refers to one of the key points of behavioural science and psychology, and that is what people say influences them and what actually influences them are very different things. Now that is a big problem for marketing. You know, why as an industry do we spend millions of pounds directly asking consumers why they buy the products they do. Because psychologists would argue that consumers will be very good at telling you lots of reasons for their purchasing, and they might not necessarily be lying. But what psychologists would say is consumers don't have full, genuine access to their own motivations. There's a wonderful psychologist called Timothy Wilson who says we are strangers to ourselves. That when we're put on the spot and asked to say why we bought a particular lager or why we shopped at a particular fashion store, we don't necessarily lie, but we often confabulate. We try and quickly on the spot generate a plausible rationalization. And although we're trying to be honest, often, because we don't have full introspective insight about motivations, those answers are often misleading. So if you do one thing differently today, it would be to be more skeptical about claim data. Because one of the biggest findings from social psychology is that it can be very misleading. So that was our first pillar, make it social. The second pillar, I also think, challenges some marketing norms. And this is the idea of make it easy. And this draws on the work of a Stanford psychologist called B.J. Fogg. And Fogg argues that when people are or when marketers or behavioural people interested in behaviour change, when they're trying to change the behaviour of consumers, Fogg argues they fixate too much on changing motivation and not enough effort goes to making the desired behaviour as easy as possible. Now, Fogg argues that's a problem for two reasons. Firstly, changing motivation is very hard. And secondly, it's a problem because it's only half the equation. Making desired behaviour as easy as possible is equally important, but people tend to underestimate its importance. So not enough time, money, energy or effort goes into making purchasing or behaviour change as simple and friction-free as possible. On one hand, there is I think, boring but very important implication of Fogg's work, which is that all of us should go through our customer journey and try and identify tiny bits of friction that seem inconsequential and not worth us bothering about, and putting more money and effort into removing those. So that's one implication of this idea of make it easy. But where I really wanted to focus is maybe on some of the more counterintuitive ideas that behavioural science brings. I don't just want to tell you things that you know but are maybe in the organisation aren't putting enough attention towards. And so one area that I thought I'd focus on today is an interesting set of experiments about how do you make big bits of behaviour change easier to do? How do you persuade people to change their behaviour if they don't really want to? And for that, I want to turn to the work of two more Stanford psychologists called Friedman and Fraser. And in their experiment, they try to persuade American homeowners to put up big, ugly signs in their front gardens saying, "Drive carefully." Now, they did this in one of two ways. So the control was to go to homeowners' houses, knock on the doors, and give them a spiel about why road safety was such a big issue. And then after that 5-minute talk, they asked the homeowners if they would put up this giant 16 square foot sign in their front garden saying, "Drive carefully." Most people do not want a big ugly sign in their front garden, so most people refused. Only 17% of homeowners accepted. But then Friedman Fraser tried a different tact in the test scenario. In this scenario, they went to another group of homeowners' houses, knocked on the door, gave them exactly the same spiel about road safety. But then at the end, rather than asking them to put up a giant sign, they asked the homeowners to put up a tiny little sticker, about 3 inches long, 1 inch tall, a tiny little sticker in their window saying drive carefully. Now, it was such an inconsequential ask that virtually all homeowners agreed. About 90–95% of people agreed to put up this sticker. Freeman and Fraser then leave, they wait 2 weeks, and then they come back. And then they knock on the homeowners' doors and they say to them, will you put up this giant sign? Now, of the 95% of people who've put up the little sticker, 3/4 of them then go on to put up the giant sign. So we've got very different performance in this test group than the control group. In the control group, it was 17% putting up the sign. In the two-step process, it was, once you've netted out the two numbers, it was about 2/3 of people, about 66–67% of people put up the big sign. So Freeman and Fraser called this the foot in the door technique. And they argued it's a really effective technique because as people, we have a strong desire to be consistent. We have an awful lot of negative phrasing for people who are inconsistent. So what Freeman and Fraser argued is happening was when they went to that second group of homeowners, when they returned for the second time, and they asked those people to put up that big sign, what happened was the homeowners looked back to their past behavior. They remembered that they were the kind of people who put up this little sticker. So they felt to be consistent with that public display, they should put up the giant sign. So Freeman and Fraser argued, if you want people to make a really big bit of behavior change, don't try and do it in one foul swoop. You need to identify the smallest thing that you can ask of that audience that will get them to change their identity, and then follow up with your bigger, genuine ask. And that is a much more effective tactic. So if you have any big bits of behavior change, you might want to keep that in mind, this idea of the foot in the door technique. That's the idea of make it easy, that firstly, the ease of behavior change is often underestimated. Marketers get fixated with changing motivation, and Fogg and others argue that's a mistake. We should give equal importance to making the desired behavior as easy as possible. And then secondly, we've got these ideas from Freeman and Fraser about the foot in the door technique, little techniques for turning big bits of behavior change into something much simpler. Well, that leads us on to our third pillar. So make it attractive. And here, unlike some of the other pillars, there are two implications. Firstly, how do you attract attention? And then secondly, how do you make a message as attractive as possible? So let's start with the first idea, how to attract attention. Again, I think this is something that is ignored too much. We live in a very busy, noisy world. Consumers have a huge amount of demands on their attention. So even getting noticed is a hell of an achievement. And behavioural science and social psychologists have a number of different tactics to improve our odds of our messaging being noticed. And one of these is an idea called the von Restorff effect. Now, before I get into the academic experiments, I want to show you a bit of a silly live demonstration of the von Restorff effect. So I'm going to show you a poster, and it's going to be a poster of a genuine heavy metal festival in the US. And I want you to look at the poster and just think, what's the first one or two bands that you notice? So here's the poster. It's for the Bay Area Death Fest 2. And one of the bands people tend to notice first is Party Cannon. And I think Party Cannon realised something that eludes 90% of brands, and that is the idea that we are hardwired to notice what is distinctive. This idea doesn't come from Californian heavy metal festival posters. There are roots going all the way back to 1933 and the work of a German pediatrician and psychologist called Hedwig von Restorff. And in her classic experiment, she recruits people to take part in experiments. She gives them long lists of information. So she might give them lots and lots of lines of information. On the first line are 3 numbers, say 174. Next line are some more numbers. Next line are some more numbers. And then she'll throw in 3 letters, DYA. And then she'll go back to her numbers again. Now she gives people these long lists of information and she says, look at the list for 5 minutes. She then takes away the lists and then she asks people to recall, once the lists have been removed, as much as they possibly can. And her key finding is that when people are given long lists of numbers, they're more likely to remember the letters. When they get given long lists of letters, they're more likely to remember the numbers. We're hardwired to notice and remember what is distinctive. So this became known as the von Restorff effect or the isolation effect. It is not a bizarre factor of the 1930s. This is not something, though, that has gone out of date. I redid von Restorff's experiment in 2016 and saw very similar patterns. We gave people big pages of logos. Sometimes they'd all be fast foods apart from one car logo, or a long list of numbers, and they'd all be blue apart from one black number. And what we saw again and again, by a factor of up to 30, people are more likely to remember the distinctive item. Now, why? Firstly, I think this is that rerun of the experiment is interesting. Is that when I was talking at the beginning, I was saying what's wonderful about behavioural science is it's very robust. It's based on experimentation rather than opinion. But best of all, you don't have to rely on, or you don't have to take these experiments on faith. The brilliant thing about behavioural science is all the experiments are in the public domain. And if you find an experiment like social proof or the foot in the door technique or the von Restorff effect, you can access the original study and then you can quickly and easily rerun the study to make sure it works for your category in your market today. And that's a lot of why I wrote The Choice Factory. I ran a huge amount of these classic studies. I reran them again and showed that studies that have been found to work in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s still work in very commercial settings today. So one of the brilliant things about behavioural science is this robustness, but the best bit, perhaps, the reason maybe I love it so much, is that you can rerun these studies yourself. But back to von Restorff. One of the interesting things about this study is I think it's very different from how most brands behave. You know, most brands cling to category convention. But von Restorff would say this is exactly the opposite of what you should do. If you want to be noticed, you shouldn't ape category convention, you should break it. So after the webinar, maybe sit down and think about all the category conventions for your particular brand. Some of them you'll probably find you need to adhere to because there are very good reasons for sticking with them. But I bet you many of them will only be there out of tradition. And it's those category conventions that you should disrupt. As I mentioned at the beginning of this section, it's not just about attracting attention. It's also about making messages attractive. And you might be wondering, well, you know, party cannon, yes, they catch someone's eye, but don't they damage their brand by deviating so much from what everyone else is doing? And there's a lot of evidence that isn't the case. And in particular, there's an idea from this lady, Francesca Gino. So she is professor at the Harvard Business School. And she came up with a wonderful insight called the red sneaker effect. And it's so called because of one of her initial studies into dress codes. And what she did, early 2000s, she went to academic conferences. And at these conferences, there was the strong social norm of dressing smartly. So you were expected to turn up in a blazer and shirt if you're a bloke, and probably no tie. And what Gino did was, as people arrived, she marked down on a scale from, scruffy to very smartly dressed, how people were attired. And then after she'd got that kind of score on her continuum, she went and spoke to the person and asked them how many citations they had. So a citation is simply the number of times you as an academic have been quoted by other academics in peer-reviewed papers. So it's a very good way of quantifying the success of an academic. A little bit crude, but very good guide. But the key thing about Gino's work was she found that there was an inverse correlation between smartness of dress and number of citations. So the scruffier people were far more successful than the ones who were abiding by the social norm. Now, what Gino argued was two key points. She firstly argued that this happens because it's only people who have a degree of social capital who can afford to break norms. Now, if the CEO turns up and she's dressed very scruffily, no one's going to say anything. If the intern does the same and they turn up in ripped jeans at this conference, they'll be sent home. So Gino firstly argues you can only break category conventions if you have a degree of social capital. But then she follows it up with other experiments that show that people are remarkably attuned to this. They realize that there's status involved in category convention breaking. People pick up on this. So the interesting thing is, when you think about the von Restorff effect, is not only will you attract attention by being distinctive, but if you break a well-known norm and your brand are aware of that norm of behavior, you will look higher status than other brands in the category who are abiding by those category conventions. So the von Restorff effect is one way not only to gain attention, but also to make yourself more attractive. Now, that's a broad area of all the pillars that we're going to talk about today. Making it attractive is probably the most broad, but that is one route to addressing two of those key principles within Make It Attractive. But that brings us on to the final pillar of the East framework. And that is the idea of making it timely. And it's the idea that the same message can have a markedly different effect dependent on when people hear or see it. Now, because we're coming to the close of this presentation, I thought that maybe the most appropriate idea within Make It Timely to talk about was all about the power of endings. And for this work, I want to turn to some experimentation done by two psychologists, Daniel Kahneman, who many of you have heard of, 2002 Nobel Prize winner, and Donald Radelmeyer. And these two psychologists began to think about the idea that people cannot possibly remember everything. There's no way you're going to remember everything from this webinar. You're not going to remember everything that happened to you at work yesterday. You're not going to remember everything that happened over the Easter weekend. We can't possibly remember everything, because if we did, we would have so much information in our heads we'd just grind to a halt. So from there, the psychologists began to wonder, well, if we don't remember everything, why is it some things are more memorable than others? And once they began thinking about that, they made the slightly weird leap to recruiting 626 colonoscopy patients. And they recruited these colonoscopy patients to test out some of their ideas. So colonoscopy is a deeply unpleasant medical procedure that lasts about 15 minutes. And the psychologists recruited these genuine patients going for genuine operations. And as they were going to the operating theatre, the psychologist gave them a handheld device. So about the size of a mobile phone. And on this device had a little dial. The device buzzed every minute. And when it buzzed, the patients had to twist the dial from either a score of 0, which indicated they were in absolutely no pain, or a score of 10, which said they were in excruciating pain. So because the operation lasts 15 minutes, the psychologist got 15 readings, and they called these readings the experiencing self because they were in-moment ratings. So 15 ratings. The next thing they did is they wait for the operation to end, they wait for the patient to get dressed and come out, and then they say to them, can you give us a single judgment of how bad the operation was? So they get another rating. They then wait a month. They then find the patients again, and they ask them the same question to get another rating. So now they've got 15 ratings for what they call the experiencing self, those in-moment ratings, and 2 ratings from the remembering self, these reflections after the event. Before they did the study, most people thought those 2 numbers should loosely correlate. The average experience of the event should pretty much match our memory of the event. But that is not what happened. Kahneman and Radelmeyer found there was only a very weak correlation. What predicted people's memory far better were 2 moments in particular. The peak moment of the experience, so in the case of colonoscopy is the worst moment, that's the peak experience, and then the final moment. So it was that last and penultimate rating that were a much better guide to what people remembered. So if they were really bad, people remembered the whole experience as really bad, but if they were very low, people would remember the whole experience as very low. Kahneman and Radelmeyer then found a number of different situations and retested the idea. And again, they saw this same pattern, that the 2 moments that we are disproportionately likely to remember are the peak of an experience, which is either the worst bit or the best bit, and the final moments. So they coined the phrase the peak end rule. It might seem like the peak end rule and colonoscopies have nothing to do with marketing. But remember, with all these experiments, the key thing is not to think about the minor details of the setting. It's to think about what the fundamental principle is. And this principle that 2 moments are particularly powerful in shaping memory can be applied everywhere in marketing, whether it's your creative or in your customer experience. Now, to make that a bit more practical, I'll give you an example. And I want to talk about a hotel in America who I think are brilliant users of the peak end rule. So this is the hotel. It's called the Magic Castle Hotel. And the hotel in many ways isn't that great on an objective level. If you look at the photo, you can see it's got kind of garish yellow 70s decor. Or if you have a look at the pool, certainly by American standards, that's not that big. And actually the rooms are a little bit pokey as well. Yet when I tried to ring them and book a room within, or at least email them, book a room with 2 months notice, it's quite expensive. They wanted £254 for a room. So you would think that this mix of expense and poor quality in certain respects, that should be toxic. But if you look at the reviews on TripAdvisor, and last time I checked, there were 3,500 reviews, but check for yourself after the webinar. When I last checked, 94% of those reviews were either excellent or very good. That is the second highest rated hotel in the whole of Los Angeles, far better than lots of very famous hotels like the Four Seasons. And the reason they get this amazing customer feedback is that they are masters in applying the peak end rule. What they have realized is firstly the peak part, that on a finite budget, you can't improve everything. You know, if you try to spread your budget across everything, like the staff training, their decor, their uniforms, you would spread yourself so thinly that none of those improvements would be memorable. Far better, like Kahneman and Rademeyer suggest, to create 1 or 2 moments of peak excellence. That's what creates brilliant memories. So what the Magic Castle do, one little example, is what they call the Popsicle Hotline. So it's a old-fashioned, red-handled phone at the side of the pool. You can pick up that phone any time of the day or night, 24/7, speak to the guy on the other end, and ask for as many ice lollies or as many flavours as you want. And a few minutes later, out the guy comes. He's dressed the nines, he's got a silver platter and this mound of free ice lollies for you and your family. And if you look at those reviews, and definitely check these out this afternoon, if you look at the reviews, I reckon about half, maybe 2/3 of the reviews specifically mention the Popsicle Hotline. By doing one thing brilliantly, they create the positive memories in a far more effective way than trying to do everything quite well. That, I think, is the first learning for brands. Create single moments of peak excellence, not general quite goodness. The second part, and this is something that the Magic Castle Hotel don't do, and I think would make them an even better hotel, is ideally what Kahneman and Rademeyer suggest is, yes, create a peak moment, but if you only create one, it should be at the final moment of your hotel stay. That would make it particularly memorable. But unfortunately, most brands, and Magic Castle Hotel is one of them, most brands don't end on a high. You know, if you're in a shop, the final moments are queuing and then paying. If you're in a hotel, the final moments are paying and then hanging around in the lobby for a dispiriting afternoon. You end on a low, and that's quite dangerous from what the peak end rule tells us. So if you want to be a better applier of the peak end rule than the Magic Castle Hotel, don't just focus on creating 1 or 2 moments of excellence, make sure you focus them at the very final moment of your experience. And the reason I like that as a recommendation is partly it's based on a robust insight from 2 brilliant behavioural scientists, but partly it's also very practical. There's a lovely phrase from David Ogilvy where he said, "Give me the freedom of a tight brief." What he meant by that was, if you say to someone, try and make a hotel stay the best there can be, it's too broad a brief to get those brilliant ideas. What creatives needs are constraints. And if you say instead, how do we create the checkout experience to be the best there is? Suddenly that's a tight enough brief to come up with brilliant ideas. So not only have you got the academic evidence that will make it memorably, there's also practical benefits too. That was a very quick whiz through 130 years of behavioural science. My key points today are that if you want this to be a practical subject, if you want to use it day in, day out, I don't think it's enough just to know that there are these thousands of biases and thousands of experiments in existence. You need to use a framework. And there are others out there, and I think worth exploring some of them to find out which works best for you. I would recommend starting with the EAST framework. I love its simplicity. I love its flexibility. And if you are interested in the EAST framework, if you Google EAST framework BIT, you can download a report from the Behavioural Insights team telling you lots of details about it, how to use it, all free, and lots of lovely examples. However, that is a report written by some civil servants. So if that sounds a little off-putting, here are 6 books that I would recommend to get better versed in behavioural science. And I'm only biased about one of them. So the first, probably the most relevant, is the top left one. It's by the CEO of the Behavioural Insights team, and it takes you through the EAST framework, how to apply it, and some lovely examples. It's similar to that free PDF you can download, but I think it's written in a much more accessible way, so that's definitely recommended. Then there are 2 general psychology books that I would recommend. Cialdini's Influence, absolute classic, 1984, sold hundreds of thousands, if not millions of copies. He was the guy who came up with the idea of social proof. And in that book, he identifies his 6 principles of persuasion, which is arguably another framework. The other general psychology book is the one on the far right, bottom right, Stuart Sutherland's Irrationality. Again, absolutely brilliant book. As an indicator of quite how good it is, when it went out of print a few years ago, copies on eBay were selling for over £100. You know, people who'd lost their copy really liked it and wanted to get another one and were quite desperate to do so. They were prepared to pay £100. So hopefully that indicates to you quite how powerful it is. You don't need to spend £100 any longer. It's, I think, £7.99, £8.99 on Amazon. But then once you've read a couple of those general psychology books, they can get a little bit repetitive. So I would argue you probably need to start looking at specialist books, books that take psychology and apply it to one area. And the 2 areas that I think are probably most relevant to most of you would be pricing. Surely that's relevant to everyone here. Wonderful book by William Poundstone called Priceless. And it looks at a whole range of behavioural biases, but just applies them to the psychology of price. That is very good reading. And then the final 2 books, 2 books that apply behavioural science to marketing. So you've got one of the originals, lovely book by Phil Barden called Decoded. And then my book, The Choice Factory, which is 25 behavioural biases. And I just quickly run through what that bias is, the academic evidence behind it, the experiments that I've done to show it works today, and finally the practical implications. So if you are interested in behavioural science, I think those 6 books might be a good place to start. But in the meantime, if you have any questions at all, please do shout. I would love to hear from you and maybe to continue the discussion.
Thanks very much, Richard. That was excellent.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
We do have some questions from people. If you've got any more questions, just shoot them to Richard. We've got one from Caroline from Guy & Co, which asks, in your experience, what are the biggest mistakes that marketers make when trying to apply behavioural science?
Oh, great question. Thank you, Caroline. So one that we've touched on, and then one that we haven't so much. So the first one is this problem of asking people why they do the things they do. It is a theme again and again from behavioural science that what people claim motivates them and what actually motivates them are wildly different things. So I spoke about the Cialdini towel experiment. That isn't a one-off. There's another lovely experiment by Adrian North, which proves a similar point. So what North does is he works for the supermarket and he persuades that supermarket to let him alter the music they play in the wine aisle. So one occasion it's German music, one occasion it's French music. And then he monitors the sales of French and German wine. So he ignores all the other wine and just looks at those 2 countries. And what he sees is that when the French music's playing, 77% of wine from those 2 countries is French, 77% of the wine that's sold. And when it's German music that's playing, 73% of the wine that's sold is German. So on one hand, you've got this quite interesting experiment about how a tiny little bit of environmental influence can shift purchasing behaviour. But in reference to your question, Caroline, the most relevant part is what he does next. So North stops people as they're leaving the supermarket, asks if they've bought wine. If they say yes, he says, did you buy any French or German wine? If they say yes, he then asks them why they bought that wine. And even though he saw these wild swings in behaviour, only 2% of people said they had bought their French or German wine because of the music. And even when he asked them point blank and prompts them and says, did you buy your wine because of the music? 86% of them deny the music had any implication at all. So the single biggest mistake, I think, is taking claim data, survey data, focus group data at face value and shaping your communications based on that, because it will often send you off in the wrong directions. You know, in those two examples, you would turn off the music and you wouldn't bother using the social proof message. The second, oh, sorry, go on, yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were finished there.
Oh, no, sorry. The second thing I was going to say, so to another behavioural mistake that is, it's a little less common, but it's happening a lot at the moment with COVID and the current crisis, is a flip side of social proof. And it's this idea called negative social proof. It's a lovely series of experiments around theft, which Cialdini again did to prove it. And essentially he shows if you tell people an antisocial behaviour is commonplace, what happens is you remove a sense of transgression and that behaviour becomes more common still. So there's a lovely study done in the Arizona Petrified Wood National Park proving that. But the reason I mention it now is Cialdini says that that is the big mistake of government communications. Now, you think back to all the ads the government have about, loads of people are missing doctor's appointments, it's, bad, don't do it. Or lots of youths are carrying knives, don't. Or lots of people, students are going out and getting drunk. Cialdini's work says that however well-meaning that is, by emphasising that it's a common behaviour, you remove a sense of transgression and it becomes more common still. Now think about a lot of the communications about social distancing, sunbathing in parks, going out in groups, stockpiling. Inadvertently, that is probably, or could to a degree, Cialdini's work would suggest that could well be making the situation worse. If you go out and tell people that lots of others aren't following social distancing rules, it will probably make the situation worse. So those might be two mistakes. One's a very commonplace one and one's more relevant to the situation at hand.
Yeah, a lot of people asking about the current situation, which I think you kind of touched on a little bit there, but I'll ask a different question, which is from Alan Ainsley from Free Agent, who asks, is there another example of a small change which produced a disproportionately big impact that you could share?
So certainly in terms of a very big impact, one of the examples that I think is fascinating is around the packaging of Nespresso, arguably. So what's interesting in Nespresso is they tap into this idea called price relativity. So it's the idea that when people are weighing up the merits of a product in terms of how good value it is, they don't have some universal scale. They don't think I'm prepared to pay £1 per unit of happiness and use that scale whether they're looking for a can of Coke or a pair of trainers. And the reason they don't do that is these kind of cross-category calculations would be ludicrously complex. So what people tend to do instead is almost what sometimes called a bounded rationality. They replace a very complex question with something much simpler. And they just say to themselves, how much did I pay for something similar in the past? And if this new thing I'm being asked to buy is more, it's bad value. If it's less, it's good value. Now that should interest marketers because it suggests that value is relative rather than absolute. Now, why that's interesting, why it relates to Nespresso is brands can change their competitive set or their mental comparison set, what people compare them to, with some quite small tweaks to how they're sold. So going back to Nespresso, if a lesser brand than Nespresso, I think, had launched that product, what they might have done is packaged their coffee up into half-kilo bags and sold it on the shelves of Tesco. If they had done that, and if they charged the same per gram price they do today, those bags of coffee would cost about £60. Now, there is no way on earth any right-minded consumer would pay £60 for a bag of coffee because the comparison set in that instance would be with bags of coffee from Dow Egberts or Cafe Direct that cost £5 or £10. What Nespresso did so brilliantly is a tiny, tiny tweak. Rather than sell in bags, they sold in pods. Now, as soon as people see a pod, which gives you a cup-sized serving of coffee, the comparison set they think of is Starbucks or Caffè Nero. So suddenly when people start thinking of that as their comparison set, the 50 pence that Nespresso want for a pod of coffee looks remarkably good value compared to the £3 that Caffè Nero want for a flat white. But 50 pence for a pod, £60 for a bag, it's exactly the same per gram price. One feels like an absolute rip-off, one feels like a bargain. And that's a real world example. So it's never just one bias, but the vast majority of that success, I think, is due to the changing of their comparison set. And it wasn't a huge costly intervention. It was a reasonably simple packaging intervention that's had a massive impact. I mean, that must be worth billions of euros to Nespresso.
The decoy effect's a bit similar to that, isn't it, Richard? In terms of having comparisons side by side. And
yeah, so there's a couple of interesting ones. So there's the decoy effect, and then one that's very similar to the decoy effect, but has maybe more use for. There's a broader range of uses. Is extremeness aversion. So the idea is, if you give people multiple options, part of the reason they'll pick a particular option is the relative position, not just the inherent attributes of that product. So give an example with these things. There's a lovely bit in Phil Barden's Decoded where he talks about a company called Mountain View. And Mountain View set up this bar, and they begin by selling two beers, cheap beer and an expensive beer. So cheap beer, let's say, is Carling, a pounder can, and the expensive beer is Budvar for £2 a can. And what they find is about 2/3 of people pick Budvar and a third pick Carling. Then later on in the evening, they introduce a third beer, a very cheap beer, Tesco Value Lager, costs 20 pence. What they see is no one buys Tesco Value Lager, but what's interesting is the ratio between Budvar and Carling changes. So now 50% buy Carling, 50% buy Budvar. So what they argued is part of the reason you pick a particular product is its inherent characteristics, inherent attributes. You might particularly like the flavour of Budvar or Carling, but that's not the only thing. Part of the reason you pick a product is what they call through extremeness aversion. It's the relative position. And a simple rule of thumb people have is to pick the middle option. Because in this situation, they worry that the cheap might be bad quality. It might make them look like they are mean. But the very expensive one might make them look like they're a show-off, or it might be a waste of money. So the simple application for that idea of extremeness aversion is, if you are in a market where you have a basic product and a premium product, the best way to upsell people, or one of the ways to upsell people, is not to keep on adding more and more functionality to your premium product, which is very expensive and destroys your margins. It's to introduce a super premium product, which by comparison will make your premium product cheaper. Look better value. So the extremeness aversion is a lovely idea, and you can see charities use it, and you can see publishers often using it by giving you 3 different offerings. And the purpose of that very expensive one is often not that anyone actually buys it; it's to steer you to the middle option rather than defaulting to the cheapest version.
Richard, I think that's all we've got time for at the minute, and we've got a few different questions about negative bias and things like that, but I think a lot of the books that you recommended can actually answer a few of them. So yeah, thank you very much, Richard.
Well, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much to Edrington as well for sponsoring Inspiring Minds. If you're interested in any more Marketing Society events, we've got Under the Spotlight with Area Foods and Microsoft on the 21st of April, and that's a webinar as well, live from Dubai. Doesn't really matter where it's from, it's on the internet. So then we've got Brave Conversation with Nationwide, Sarah Benison on May the 6th, and that's a webinar as well, obviously. Everything's a webinar now. Next, Inspiring Minds is on crisis management, and it's going to be in May. Look out for details in comms and on websites and through the newsletter. Thanks very much again, Richard. It was really interesting. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you very much.